Bodies emerging from a forgotten lake, but with no record of missing persons. No names, no clues, no history, as if those lives never existed. Can you imagine anything more disturbing than discovering that someone can be erased from the collective memory, as if they were just a breath lost in time? I'm Katherine, and what I'm about to share with you is an investigation that defies the limits of logic. The Lake of the Forgotten is not just a crime scene, it's a puzzle that challenges our sense of identity, memory, and existence. Every detail I encountered there sent me spiraling into unanswered questions, where reality and illusion mingled in a frightening way. Because the mystery lay not only in the bodies, but in the absolute silence that surrounded them. And as I continued my investigation, I realized something even more disturbing. Perhaps the lake's true secret wasn't about the dead, but about the living who could still be erased. I arrived home late one night when the phone rang. On the other end, a tense voice informed me that bodies were emerging from a forgotten lake in the countryside, a place so silent it seemed frozen in time. It wasn't just bodies. The detail that caught my attention was that there was no missing persons record that matched the situation. This already sounded like the kind of case that would haunt me for nights on end. On the way to the scene, I couldn't stop thinking about the absurdity of it all. How could bodies turn up without anyone having searched for them before? It was as if these people had never existed, and the thought gave me a strange chill. I had faced gruesome crimes before, investigations full of secrets, but this combination of death and oblivion seemed to open an abyss within me. When I arrived at the lake, the scene was even more disturbing. The dark waters reflected the full moon, and floating above them were the bodies, motionless, almost serene, as if resting in silence. The smell was heavy, but what disturbed me most was the absence of despair around. There were no family members, no crying, only silence and the confused looks of the police officers. The feeling was that those lives had been snuffed out before they even emerged. As I watched the scene, I realized my mind was beginning to form questions I didn't even know how to answer. Who were these people? Why wasn't anyone claiming them? And most importantly, how could someone disappear without a trace, without even existing on paper? Deep down, I already knew this case wouldn't just be about bodies in a lake. There was something bigger and even darker waiting for me in those waters. The lake lay far from town, hidden by a narrow dirt road, almost forgotten. It was the kind of place locals rarely mentioned, as if preferring to pretend it didn't exist. Some called it the Lake of the Forgotten, a name that seemed to carry a dark omen. The surrounding trees curved toward the water, as if guarding ancient secrets. Here, even the wind sounded different, muffled, heavy. As I walked along the riverbank, I remembered stray comments I'd heard in past investigations. People were said to be disappearing in that area, but there was never any proof or official record. It was always I heard it, or a distant cousin disappeared around there. No formal complaints, no police reports, as if somehow the collective memory rejected those stories. This only made it all the more intriguing. I spoke with some local police officers and realized that even they didn't feel comfortable there. It was as if the lake had a silent reputation, built over generations. There were legends of spirits calling people into the water, stories of fishermen seeing reflections of unknown faces in the waves. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I couldn't ignore the psychological impact such a place has. Places like these shape fears, create myths, and hide truth. As I listened to the stories and observed the landscape, the impression that the lake held something deeper only grew. It wasn't just bodies emerging, there seemed to be an invisible line between reality and imagination, and I was about to cross. Little did I know that by investigating the origins of that place, I would also end up diving into the abyss of the human mind. When I looked back at the lake's surface, I realized the bodies weren't simply floating. There was something disturbing about the stillness. They seemed organized, almost arranged in a macabre choreography, as if the lake itself had chosen the perfect moment to return them. The moonlight illuminated their pale faces, and the reflection made it seem as if the dead still had watchful eyes, as if watching me back. I approached cautiously, following the movements of the experts who were already trying to remove some bodies from the water. One of them caught my attention. It was the body of a young woman, her long hair still floating around her face, as if suspended in water. There were no obvious signs of advanced decomposition, which puzzled me. It didn't make sense, not considering the length of time they were supposedly submerged. The officers, nervous, whispered. I heard one of them say he'd never seen anything like it. The air was thick, as if every breath was an effort, I tried to maintain professional cool, but I confess a shiver ran down my spine. I've seen many crime scenes, but this one made me feel like I was facing something beyond my control, as if I were about to enter unfamiliar territory. I observed every detail, trying to mentally capture the expressions, the clothing, the objects that emerged along with the bodies. It wasn't just the death that caught my attention, but the strange serenity that hung over everything. It was as if that lake wasn't just a crime scene, but a silent figure harboring ancient secrets. And somehow, I knew I hadn't seen the worst yet. As the experts continued their analysis, the strangeness only grew. None of the bodies had a confirmed identity. Fingerprints were collected on the spot, but there were no matches in national databases. It was as if these people had never officially existed. This detail left me uneasy. How could someone live, die and still leave no trace on the world? I checked the pockets, the clothes, any object that might indicate their origin. Nothing. No documents, no recognizable marks, no scars anyone could describe to identify them. It was as if the lake had washed away not only the bodies, but also their story. I knew that in investigations, there's always at least a tiny clue, a detail capable of opening doors. This time, however, it seemed we were faced with absolute silence. I spoke to the coroner, and his answer didn't reassure me. I found nothing to help with identification, he said. The fingerprints were clean, the teeth didn't match any dental records, and even the skin texture seemed strangely preserved. The more he talked, the more I realized it wasn't just a technicality. There was a deliberate emptiness, as if these people had been erased from reality. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at those nameless faces. Throughout my career, I've always kept in mind that each victim had a life that needed to be reconstructed. But standing before those bodies, I felt I wasn't just looking at unsolved deaths. I was looking at denied existences, ripped away identities, and this idea began to echo in my mind like an unanswered riddle, ready to drag me deeper into the investigation. The first medical reports arrived faster than I expected, but they offered no clarity. The coroner took me aside, and with an expression that mixed perplexity and weariness, revealed that the bodies had different dates of death. Some appeared to have died decades ago, others just a few years ago, and yet they all emerged together, as if the lake had chosen a precise moment to return them. This detail intrigued me. Normally, decomposition time follows a clear logic, but here the rules seemed suspended. How could ancient bones and nearly intact tissue coexist side by side? I dealt with gruesome crimes before, but this blend of science and mystery made me feel like I was trying to decipher a puzzle with half the pieces missing. The lake seemed to laugh at us, hiding the secret in its dark water. As I read the reports, I realized the pattern of deaths was unusual. Some bodies showed signs of drowning, others appeared to have undergone some form of restraint before death, and there were even those with no visible marks, as if life had simply been extinguished. Each victim was a puzzle within a puzzle. It felt like I wasn't just investigating crimes, but a sequence of stories forcibly interrupted. I gathered the team and shared my impressions. I saw suspicious looks, some seeking rational explanations, others avoiding the strangeness. It became clear to me that this case would not be limited to forensic analysis. We would need to go beyond science, seek invisible patterns, perhaps even delve into memories that refused to be remembered. And at that point, I began to realize that the lake held more than just bodies. It held stories that insisted on emerging, even against oblivion. With each body examined, one detail caught my attention. All exhibited signs of trauma prior to death. These weren't just physical marks, but frozen expressions on their faces, as if the fear had been permanently imprinted on them. Some had wrists with restraint marks, others had wide eyes, in a state of indescribable terror. I'd seen many victims in my career, but this collective pattern seemed almost rehearsed. I spoke with forensic psychology experts, and the answer was unanimous. It was no coincidence. Each of those individuals seemed to have been subjected to a level of psychological terror that left them paralyzed. Interestingly, there were no clear signs of traditional torture. It was as if the enemy were invisible, something that infiltrated the mind before taking life. This observation only deepened the mystery. I began scribbling notes, trying to find a link between the victims, people of different ages, seemingly from different eras, but all bearing the same invisible mark of anguish. Were they trapped in the same cycle of horror, repeated over time? Or was there someone somewhere with the ability to manipulate human fear to the very edge of survival? These questions tormented me as I observed those motionless faces. The lake no longer seemed like just a backdrop. It was slowly becoming a mirror of the human mind, capable of reflecting not only death, but also the deepest traumas. I knew I needed to go beyond the surface, to understand what united these victims. But with each step, the feeling that I was entering a psychological labyrinth only grew. And within this labyrinth, I myself began to feel the first cracks in my sanity. I decided I needed to hear from those who lived nearby. I've always believed that behind legends and rumors lie fragments of truth waiting to be deciphered. So I knocked on doors trying to coax stories from people that usually get buried between barroom whispers and family gatherings. That's when disturbing reports emerged. Some claimed to have seen strange lights floating over the lake on foggy nights. Others swore they heard voices calling their names, even when they were alone. An elderly man with calloused hands and a wary look told me he used to fish on that lake when he was young. He said he sometimes saw reflections of faces not in the boat, faces that seemed to emerge from the water itself. I wasn't imagining it, young lady, he repeated, shaking his head as if trying to dispel uncomfortable memories. His conviction was so strong that I felt a chill run down my spine. If it were just fantasy, why did it still torment him after all these years? I also heard stories of silent disappearances, people who suddenly disappeared from the community, but no one had the courage to formally report it. It was as if the lake held an authoritative presence, imposing fear and silence. Families preferred to forget, as if naming what happened would invoke the same fate. For an investigator, this was both fascinating and despairing. How to deal with witnesses who refused to believe their own account. By the end of the interviews, I was left with the feeling that the lake not only frightened people but also shaped their memories. An invisible field of forgetfulness seemed to hover over everyone who lived there. The more I listened, the clearer it became. It wasn't just a physical place, it was a kind of psychological entity, capable of manipulating human perception, and somehow I myself was already beginning to feel its effects. While watching the removal of some bodies, I noticed something metallic glistening beneath the shallow water. I asked one of the divers to check, and he soon surfaced with a small rusty box. Inside we found a damp diary, a time-worn necklace, and an iron key covered in mud. 3 simple objects, but together they seemed to carry a disproportionate weight. It hadn't been thrown in randomly, it looked like a message. I held the diary carefully, trying to preserve the fragile pages. Some were illegible, smudged by water, but there were still passages that seemed to endure as if written to survive oblivion. The necklace, in contrast, conveyed a strange familiarity. It wasn't valuable or flashy, but it evoked an uneasy feeling, like when you see something you should recognize but can't quite place it. As for the key, that intrigued me deeply. There was no lock in sight that could match. It was heavy, ancient, almost handmade, with signs of wear that told a long story. I couldn't help but wonder what was this key trying to open, and more importantly, was there still time to find the right door? As I packed the objects into an evidence bag, I realized my mind kept making connections. Perhaps they were clues from different victims, or perhaps they belonged to a single fragmented story. Either way, the message was clear. The lake didn't just yield body, it also returned pieces of narratives that needed to be reconstructed, and I was willing to follow that thread, no matter how dark the destination it led me to. That same night, I sat alone leafing through the diary I'd found at the lake. The pages were stained and fragile, but with patience, I managed to decipher a few sentences. What I read left me speechless for long minutes. The notes were short, fragmented, as if the author were in a hurry to record something he feared he'd forgotten. "They call me in my dreams," read one passage. Another read, "They are people who never existed, but I know I've known them." It affected me more than I'd like to admit. In my investigations, I found farewell letters, confessions of crimes, even the ravings of disturbed minds. But this diary seemed to tread a blurry line between reality and imagination. It wasn't just desperation, it was the struggle of someone trying to prove their own existence as everything around them faded into memory. And I wondered, how do you investigate someone who may never have actually existed? Each sentence felt like a purposefully incomplete puzzle. Instead of answers, the diary offered more enigma. On one page, a poorly drawn drawing showed silhouettes lined up, as if they were shadows waiting for something. On another, there were repeated numbers with no apparent logic, but which seemed to carry some kind of The diary wasn't just a record, it was almost a psychological trap, designed to confuse anyone who dared to read it. I closed the notebook and stared at the reflection of the lake in the distance. A part of me wondered if I myself wasn't beginning to lose touch with reality, because the deeper I delved into those words, the more I felt they belonged to me too, as if they echoed thoughts I'd never written down, but which were hidden within me. And this detail, I confess, frightened me more than the bodies I saw that night. As I reviewed the diary and cross-referenced information with the reports, I began to formulate an uncomfortable hypothesis. Perhaps we weren't dealing with a common crime, but a phenomenon that directly attacked the victim's mind. I considered mass hysteria, mass psychological manipulation, or even some kind of experiment capable of erasing identities. The idea seemed absurd, but how could one explain unmarked bodies, erased memories, and reports of voices in the lake? I spoke with a colleague in forensic psychology, and even without revealing all the details, I could tell her reaction was one of discomfort. She mentioned cases in which people created false memories, or completely lost track of who they were, for no apparent reason. But this wasn't about one individual or another, but rather a pattern. It was as if someone or something had the ability to manipulate the most intimate essence of human identity. This line of reasoning made me uneasy, because if it were true, we wouldn't just be dealing with mysterious deaths, but with the complete annulment of human existence. There would be no family left to mourn, no friends to search for, no documents to prove who they were. It was as if the lake collected people and then returned only anonymous bodies, stripping them of the one thing that shouldn't be stolen, their memory. I confess that, at that moment, a cruel doubt began to creep in. If someone can erase a person's identity to that extent, who can guarantee that my own memories are real? What if part of my life had also been stolen, without me realizing it? This thought followed me like a shadow, and I knew that the investigation would only deepen this feeling of instability. As I continued my analysis, a persistent memory began to haunt me. Years ago, I nearly lost someone very close to me, under circumstances that still seem hazy to me today. The person was found without memory, disoriented, as if part of their identity had been forcibly ripped away. I never got any definitive answers, but now, faced with the lake and its bodies, without a past, the connection seemed inevitable. It was as if the case were pulling at the threads of my own story. I spent the night awake, revisiting old photos, trying to recall details I might have overlooked. What hurt me most was realizing that some memories had faded, as if time or something beyond it had decided to deprive me of certain fragments. It wasn't just the mystery of the lake that tormented me, it was the possibility that it had infiltrated my life as well, without me realizing. Professionally, I knew I should maintain emotional distance, but how? Every time I looked at those bodies, I saw in them a reflection of what I had almost lost. This parallel between my personal pain and the investigation made each step heavier, but also more urgent. Perhaps it was precisely this connection that gave me the strength to continue, as if somehow solving the case would also reclaim forgotten parts of myself. This duality was cruel. The closer I got to the truth, the more I felt I was walking on fragile ground, where any crack could swallow me. And deep down, I knew this emotional instability would be both my weapon and my weakness, because if the lake truly had the power to erase identities, what assurance did I have that I myself wasn't, little by little, being forgotten? Over the following nights, something began to increasingly bother me. As I analyzed the collected material, I noticed whispers emerging from nowhere, as if someone were saying my name right next to my ear. At first I thought it was just accumulated fatigue, the result of long hours immersed in the case. But the episodes repeated themselves, and each time they seemed clearer, more insistent, as if the lake had found a way to call me even from a distance. Once, back on shore, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The waters were still, but I swear I heard muffled, almost childish laughter echoing in the silence of the night. My instinct screamed at me to retreat, but the investigator in me needed to stay. I noted the time, the weather, every detail of the environment, trying to rationalize what was happening. But in moments like these, reason seemed to slip through my fingers. Later I noticed something even more troubling, small lapses in memory. Sometimes I'd lose entire minutes, not knowing what I was doing. One morning, I found notes in my notebook that I didn't remember writing. Short, disjointed sentences, some repeating words from the diary found in the lake. It was as if my mind was being infiltrated, drop by the same shadow that swallowed those victims. This mix of voices, laughter and lapses, shook my confidence. I'd always been disciplined, accustomed to separating reason from emotion. But here, each experience seemed to erode my grasp of reality. And if I couldn't trust my own memory, how could I continue the investigation? Still, something inside me told me this was only the beginning, and that the lake somehow still had so much more to reveal. When I gathered all the available information about the victims, I noticed a pattern that couldn't be ignored. They were lonely people, nearly invisible figures in their community, people who lived on the margins of society, without strong ties, without close families, as if they were already destined to disappear before they actually disappeared. This detail struck me. The lake seemed to choose those the world had already forgotten. I spoke with psychologists who study social isolation, and they confirmed something that made me reflect. People without connections tend to be lost more easily, not only physically, but also in the collective memory. When someone like that disappears, almost no one notices, and if no one notices, there's no record, no search, no memory. It was a cruel cycle, one that transformed loneliness into complete erasure. As I looked again at the victims' faces, I began to notice that common expression, a mixture of resignation and fear. It wasn't the immediate panic of someone struggling to survive, but the look of someone who had already given up on being seen by the world, as if the lake were merely the final destination of a process that began long before, within each of them. This realization brought a melancholy that weighed heavily on my investigation, and at the same time, it sparked a question that wouldn't leave me alone. Did the lake really attract these people, or was it simply a reflection of a society that allowed them to vanish without a trace? This fine line between mysterious phenomenon and human responsibility only made the case more disturbing, and I knew that if I wanted to get to the bottom of this, I would have to confront questions that went beyond forensic science. At a staff meeting, I heard the first attempt at an official explanation. Some colleagues suggested it could be organized crime, human trafficking, serial kidnappings, or something similar. I listened carefully, but with each hypothesis, something didn't add up. If it really was a criminal group, where were the family members demanding answers? Where were the missing person reports? The complete lack of records was what made the case so unique. One of the police officers insisted that at some point, connections would emerge, but it had been days since the discovery, and still nothing. No police reports, no old complaints, no names linked to the bodies. It was as if we were investigating ghosts. This bureaucratic silence seemed more frightening to me than the bodies themselves, because it wasn't a lack of evidence. It was the absolute lack of existence. I confess that the coldness of some police officers bothered me. To them, it was just another unsolved case, a file ready to gather dust on a shelf. But I couldn't accept. Those bodies had faces, expressions, hidden stories, and even if the world had ignored them, I couldn't do the same. My instinct told me there was something beyond rational hypotheses. However, the more I defended this line of thought, the more I noticed suspicious looks in my direction. It was as if some colleagues were beginning to doubt my objectivity, as if I were getting carried away by fantasies. Maybe they were right, maybe I was really going too deep, but in that moment, I preferred to carry the weight of doubt rather than accept a simplistic explanation that didn't do justice to the lake's mystery. It was then that a detail completely changed the course of the investigation. The key found in the lake had been on my mind. After days of trying to discover its origin, we finally managed to link it to an abandoned cabin a few kilometers away. The building was almost hidden by the forest, as if nature itself wanted to erase it from view. When I pushed open the rusty door, the heavy, musty, silent air greeted me like a punch to the chest. I walked through the interior with my flashlight in hand, and with each beam of light, signs of a disturbing story emerged. Peeling walls, dust-covered furniture, marks on the floor that looked like heavy objects had been dragged across them. But what really chilled my blood were the walls of a back room, covered in newspaper clippings, carefully pasted together, as if someone had constructed a macabre mosaic of disappearances. I looked closely at the clippings, and noticed a strange pattern. They weren't high-profile cases, nor were they official accounts of major impact. They were small notes, stories almost erased from local newspapers, of people who simply vanished without attracting attention. Some faces were so common they could go unnoticed in any crowd. It was as if someone were collecting precisely those the world overlooked. And then came the most disturbing detail. Some of these faces weren't unfamiliar to me. I had the feeling I'd seen them before, but I couldn't remember. It was as if my own memory was jumbled, unable to distinguish between reality and imagination. In that instant, I realized the cabin wasn't just a hiding place. It was a living archive of what the lake was trying to show us, and perhaps the key we unlocked was also the beginning of something much greater. With my heart racing, I moved even closer to those walls covered in clipping. They weren't just news of disappearances. Alongside the articles, someone had written handwritten comments, as if studying each case, individual words, questions,
arrows connecting different faces. Most disturbingly, some of these articles seemed to have no public archive. It was as if they had been published only to disappear. I grabbed a clipping showing a photo of a young woman and took it to the police chief, accompanying me. He swore he'd never seen that case, and even hinted that it might be a forgery, but I knew better. The aged paper, the printing, the details, everything screamed authenticity. The strangeness wasn't in the newspaper itself, but in the fact that no one, absolutely no one, seemed to remember that person. I continued examining, and found something even more unsettling: a mural of hand-drawn faces, as if sketches from memory. Some matched the cutouts, others were unfamiliar, but all conveyed the same uneasy feeling of forgotten familiarity. It was like looking at people you swear you've seen before but whose memory slips away in the next instant. This paradox left me dizzy, as if my own memories were unstable. And then came the final blow. Among the clippings was a photo of me. It wasn't recent, it looked like it had been taken from an old newspaper, but the most frightening detail was that the article's text was missing, just my image, lost among dozens of forgotten faces. At that moment, a chill ran down my spine. If the lake collected people erased from memory, why was I there too? That night, I could barely sleep. The image of my own photo among the clippings repeated like a nightmare on loop. Why was my face in that cabin? What connection did I have to those forgotten people? For the first time in years of my career, I began to question my own memory. Was there something in my past that I'd blocked out? Or was the lake already pulling me toward the same fate as the victim? I spent hours in front of the mirror trying to find some trait in myself that would explain this connection. I rummaged through personal files, childhood memories, nothing seemed out of place, until I noticed a nagging detail. Several entire years of photographs and documents were missing from my memory boxes. Periods that simply weren't recorded. What else could be missing from my life that I hadn't noticed? This discovery left me vulnerable. I, who had always prided myself on mental discipline and clarity in investigations, now found myself doubting what was real. The lake seemed to have invaded not only the case, but also my mind. It was as if it were testing my limits, slowly erasing the boundaries between memory and invention. The fear was not just of discovering the truth, but of losing it completely. And the more I tried to resist, the more I felt the lake's presence in every detail of my daily life. The water appeared in my dreams, always reflecting faces I didn't recognize. The voices once whispered, now seemed to want to speak to me. And deep down, a question echoed insistently: if everyone who emerged from the lake was forgotten by the world, how much time did I have left before I too disappeared from everyone's memory?
Just when the investigation seemed to be mired in silence and doubt, something unexpected happened. They found a survivor. He was a disoriented, middle-aged man, wandering near the lakeshore, as if he had just emerged from a trance. We rushed to his aid, and I soon realized this was no ordinary witness. His eyes held the same emptiness I saw in the bodies, but there was a breath of life in him, a resilience the others lacked. I tried to talk, but he seemed incapable of formulating clear answers. I asked his name, his origins, if he remembered anyone who might look for him. Nothing. He just repeated loose phrases, like a scratched record: the lake holds those who were forgotten. This repetition echoed like an enigmatic password, but also as a warning that there was something even deeper to it all. The most disturbing thing was how he reacted to my presence. Whenever our eyes met, he would stop mumbling and stare at me with an almost painful intensity. It was as if he recognized me from somewhere, but couldn't explain where. This detail made me uncomfortable, especially after I'd found my own photo among the clippings in the cabin. Did he see me as part of that cycle? I decided to take him for medical evaluation, hoping to extract more information. But deep down, something told me that this man wasn't there by chance. He seemed to be living proof that the lake not only erased identities, but also chose who to release. And that choice, somehow, seemed connected to me. The next morning, I went to the hospital to accompany the survivor, but when I arrived, the news hit me like a blow. He had disappeared. None of the doctors or nurses could explain how he was simply gone. I reviewed the security cameras and saw something that gave me chills. The man walked away alone, serene, as if he knew exactly where to go. The footage showed his footprints leading toward the lake and stopping at the water's edge. I ran to the spot indicated by the image. The footprints were there, clear, but they ended abruptly, with no way back. The lake's surface, calm as ever, reflected only the gray sky. No waves, no sign of a body. It was as if he had been swallowed back, accepted once again by the same mystery that had momentarily freed him. This scene left me speechless, with the feeling that I had lost the only living key to understanding the case. I spent hours standing on the shore watching the waters. A part of me wanted to believe he was still out there somewhere, waiting to be found. But deep down, I knew the lake doesn't return anyone by chance. It chooses its timing, its victims, even its witnesses. And now, it seemed to have chosen to take him back, perhaps to ensure the truth remained hidden. It was at that moment that realization struck me like a bitter revelation. Perhaps I would never have complete answers. Perhaps the lake existed precisely to defy our need for explanation. But an even darker doubt crept in. If he returned, would I be called to? And if so, would anyone remember me later? I closed the official report with a word I found difficult to admit: inconclusive. For the police, the case ended there, like so many others that end up shelved, waiting for explanations that never arrive. But for me, nothing was closed. As I wrote those bureaucratic lines, I felt every letter was a lie. Because I knew the lake hadn't just returned bodies, it had shown me a mirror of what we fear to forget within ourselves. Over the next few nights, I dreamed of the water again. Always the same scene, me walking to the shore, feeling my feet sink into the cold mud, while unfamiliar voices called my name. I woke sweaty, with the feeling that the dream was more real than my waking hours. My mind wavered between logic and delirium, but deep down, doubt was what gnawed at me. How long could I resist before I too would be forgotten? I began to observe small signs of everyday life with suspicion. A friend who claimed not to remember something we experienced together. A document that seemed blank where information had once been. A growing void in memories I had taken for granted. Was it simply mental wear and tear, or had the lake already extended its invisible waters to me? With each passing day, the line between investigation and personal experience grew more blurred. And though I tried to convince myself I was still in control, there was one thought that wouldn't leave me alone. Perhaps the lake wasn't just a physical place, but a force that feeds on human forgetfulness. If that's true, how long do I have left before my story disappears too? That's the question that haunts me, and that perhaps one day someone, silently, will find engraved on the shores of the Lake of the Forgotten. As I close this case, I can't help but reflect how many lives pass unnoticed around us, as if they never existed. The Lake of the Forgotten showed me that the true mystery lies not only in death, but in the silence that forms when no one remembers you. And perhaps this is the greatest human fear, disappearing not in the body, but in the memory of others. I learned that every detail matters, every look, every memory we leave with someone, because in the end, what keeps us alive is precisely that invisible mark we leave on those around us. And if the lake taught me anything, it's that fighting oblivion is a form of resistance. So I leave you with a challenge. What have you done to be remembered? What mark are you leaving on the world so that your story isn't lost like the waters that swallow everything in silence? Think about it. Perhaps the answer is closer than you think. And if you want to continue following my future investigations, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join me as we delve into new mysteries, because some secrets are only revealed to those brave enough to look deep.